Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Deepak Madnani. I'm your moderator for today. I thank you. I work with startups in Hong Kong, and I was talking to Vikas a couple of days ago. He asked me to moderate this panel, and essentially what I do is the education of startups, which is a lot about training. So I work with the early stage startup community in Hong Kong. I'd like to welcome His Excellency Mr. Werner, Minister of Education for Liberia, and Ms. Sandu, former Education Minister of Moldova. Thank you. Thanks for being on the panel today. And the title of today's event is Reforming Teacher Placement and Building High-Quality Teacher Structures. I hope I nailed that. I did. Excellent. Thank you. And we have two very interesting speakers today, Emiliana Vegas and Lucy Crahan. And I'm going to let the both of you introduce yourselves, and let's get the show on the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. I'm mic'd. Thank you, Minister Werner and Ms. Sandu. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Emiliana Vegas. I head the Education Division at the Inter-American Development Bank. We're based in Washington, D.C. We're a bank that provides financing and technical assistance to countries across Latin America and the Caribbean to help them improve their education systems. And our division in particular focuses on the public sector side of education. As a group, we also do some financing of private schools and private universities, but the group I lead works with governments. And I see some of our counterparts here, so thank you for attending. So in my work, I get to travel throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And prior to coming to the IDB, I worked at the World Bank as well and traveled in other parts of the world. And one thing that always struck me is how ill-equipped many ministries of education are to know who exactly are their teachers, where are they assigned to schools, and how are they performing in terms of how effective are they being in achieving the goals of getting all students to learn. And so what I wanted to pitch today is the goal of increasing transparency in how teachers are selected and assigned to teacher positions across a nation. Let me give you an example. Until very recently, actually until only about 4 years ago, in Mexico, teachers owned their own positions to the extent that they could leave them in inheritance, they could sell them in the market, and that was completely accepted and legal. And it took a real controversial constitutional reform to create a competitive process for teachers to enter as teachers and also to be assigned to teacher positions. Another example, recently I was in Panama, and the Minister of Education of Panama is actually here in Dubai right now and joining us in the conference. I wish you were here. And she and I were visiting a rural school in a very remote area of Panama that serves an indigenous community. And when we arrived, she found out that one of the teachers that she had assigned was not actually there. And it wasn't that she was an absent, but it was that although she had named her, the process of assignment hadn't been completed. And so the teacher didn't actually have her letter of, I guess, assignment to the school. In Panama, that takes about 9 steps, starting from a process that ends, it starts at the local level, goes through the ministry, and ends with actually the signature of the president of the country assigning each individual teacher throughout the country. So what I'd like to pitch for the ministers, or current ministers or former ministers, is would you be willing to introduce a transparency reform to ensure that the most talented, capable individuals get into teaching, and that they get into those positions in the schools where they could be most effective? In theory, this would be straightforward. You would need to introduce a strong information system where teacher positions are made publicly available and where criteria for accessing them is also transparent. Then individuals would need to apply and submit an evaluation. Of course, as you can imagine, the devil's in the details, And what are the criteria for evaluating teachers? Who conducts these evaluations? And ultimately, how decisions are made as to which teacher goes to which school will determine the success of the reform. In some countries, teacher unions may oppose these reforms. And in others, and even in the same countries, maybe locally elected officials, because at least in our region, but I imagine in many regions in the world, a lot of the teaching profession has become also a way for locally elected officials to reward those who voted for them. And so sometimes awarding positions based on political affiliation rather than technical or talent. So let me tell you exactly how I envision this, as this is part of my assignment. And I would say I identified 7 specific steps, so hopefully not too many. First, you would need to lead a process where you define the main competencies of an effective teacher. And this process would be in collaboration with current teachers, with teacher union representatives, with academic experts, civil society representatives, parent organizations, and private sector leaders. Just defining what in your country means to be an effective teacher and what competencies are required to serve as a teacher is a first step toward informing and being transparent about what is expected of teachers, and will go in and of itself a long way to making the career more meritocratic. Second, in a similarly collaborative process with the same stakeholders, you would need to introduce a system to evaluate existing and aspiring teachers vis-a-vis the effective teacher framework that you've developed. Now, I think this is very important, and a lesson from other countries that have implemented these kinds of systems is that before conducting the first teacher evaluation, you would want to work with all relevant stakeholders to develop a program to support existing and aspiring teachers to meet the criteria in that framework. So you'd want to know ex ante, do you have the capacity to support and develop teachers? Because the goal of the system is really to improve teacher and teacher practice, and to help all schools be staffed with effective teachers. So you don't want to evaluate teachers and find out that they're not meeting those criteria without having a plan in place to help them reach those criteria. Then you would implement the system of teacher evaluation with a clear timeline and gradually evaluate all teachers in your education system. You'd want to do it in a way that is gradual, because you probably don't have the capacity, if you've never done it before, to evaluate all teachers in the country. But you want to do it in a way that's transparent and fair, so that all teachers have equal chance of being evaluated and know that eventually all of them will be evaluated. At the same time, and this is the 5th step, you'd want to publish all the new teacher positions at the local, regional, and national level, so that potential applicants can easily access this information. You also want to make this available online, and depending, of course, of the access in your country, that may be all you need to do. 6th, you'd want to introduce a system to ensure that all new teacher posts are filled by individuals who meet the basic competencies in your teacher framework. This should include a competitive process among aspiring teachers for each position, whereby those with the best results in the teacher entrance evaluation are more likely to get assigned to the schools that need them most. And finally, but not really last, actually, from step 1, you want to make sure you have a communication strategy in place to reach all stakeholders. You want to partner with teachers. You want to work with teacher union representatives, with private sector leaders, civil society, to ensure that they all have information about why you're doing this, what is the process, and that in particular in each of these different stakeholder levels, you have advocates, so that when you're not there as the leader of the reform or your colleagues, that there are others there who understand the purpose of the reform, who will provide arguments when others are opposing. That's my pitch. I hope you like it. Thank you.
I think we're going to allow the second pitch pitch first before we open it up for questions, unless your Excellencies that you have any questions immediately. For now, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies. Thrilled to be here. My name's Lucy Crahan. I'm an international education consultant at Education Development Trust, based in the UK. In a former life, before I joined that organisation, I did some research into top-performing education systems. So I spent time in 5 of the world's top-performing systems, as defined by PISA, which of course is not the whole picture, but is one part of the picture. And I taught in schools, or helped out, and I lived with teachers to try and get an understanding of what these different systems were doing to make them so successful at having their children do well in applying reading, maths, and science. So one of the things that I noticed on these travels was that some of the countries were very lucky. So some countries managed to get themselves in a virtuous cycle when it comes to teacher quality. So take Finland, for example. So Finland, because of their history of being ruled by foreign nations, Russia and Sweden, when they eventually became independent, and actually before then as well, there was a real sense that there was a pride in being a teacher because you were a bastion of Finnishness. You were actually making sure that the children stayed Finnish. So there was a pride in being a teacher and a high status for being a teacher. Now, that has continued, not only for that reason, but because it's a high-status profession, it means that lots of people apply to be a teacher, which means that they can be selective with who comes into the profession, which means that it is high status. It maintains that status. Unfortunately, not all countries are so lucky. And actually, particularly in developing contexts, since there's been a successful expansion of education in terms of the number of students who are being educated, it has led to the lowering of the status of teachers in many countries. Because you now need more teachers than you previously had, it means that you have to lower the standards required for those teachers. So in some places you'll have teachers who don't necessarily have a teaching qualification, for example. And that lowers the status of the teachers who do have that qualification. Then they're associated with a profession in which anyone can really walk in and teach. So what can we do about this? What if we're in a situation where we're not one of the lucky countries in that favorable position, such as Finland? So I think we need a ladder to get out of that kind of downward spiral. So the opposite of the Finnish situation is this downward spiral where it's not particularly high status to be a teacher, which means that not many people apply, which means that you can't be very picky or selective about who comes into the profession. We need a ladder to get out of that. And this is what I've seen as working very well in Shanghai, China, in Singapore, and in Estonia, which is another country that is doing very well in PISA. So let me tell you how this works in Shanghai. So Shanghai has a teacher career structure, where when you first become a teacher in Shanghai, you're known as a 3rd grade teacher. That doesn't mean you teach the 3rd grade. It means you're a teacher on this level, the third level. You have to then teach for 5 years, and in those 5 years, you have various evaluations. At the end of those 5 years, evaluations of your lessons, peer evaluation, and self-evaluation. And if you pass that evaluation, you then become a 2nd grade teacher. There's then another process. Another 5 years go by. And you have to demonstrate now that not only are you able to teach very well in your own classroom, but that you're helping your peers, that you're publishing research and teaching. If you manage to pass an evaluation after those 5 years, then you become a 1st grade teacher. At each stage, your salary is increasing significantly. There's a promotional position which really has that higher status, which means that teachers are motivated to carry on improving in their teaching to attain these higher positions. Singapore has a similar system, but in Singapore it's not only 1 career structure, but 3. In Singapore, you can go down a leadership track, which many countries already have, head of department, deputy principal, principal. You can go down a classroom-based pedagogy track, becoming an expert classroom teacher, or you can go down a specialist track and decide that actually you're really interested in dyslexia and how to teach children with dyslexia. And at the top of that career structure is a master teacher who are very, very highly respected and held in high esteem. So I think this is an excellent model for 5 reasons. So I'll talk through those 5 reasons and then give you a few do's and don'ts based on the countries that I've studied, what they say. This is not, must admit, not personal experience of trying to implement these reforms. I recognize it is complex. So why is this such a promising strategy? This is why I'd like to pitch it today. I think it helps with recruitment. If you're a new graduate, you want to do something challenging and high status, and you see that there's an option for you to become a lead teacher or a master teacher, I think that would help more teachers want to go into a profession. They see the possibilities for progression. As I said, it provides an incentive to continuous improvement. So you want to get better so that you can get this next salary rise, if that's all it is. Hopefully you want to get better because for the benefit of the children. But you also know what it looks like to get better, because it's defined at each different level what that actually looks like. What knowledge do you need? What skills do you need? It helps with retention. In many places, my own country included, you can start as a teacher and you're still a teacher 30 years later. And while some very motivated teachers can continue to improve all the way along, for some, there is no sense of career progression. So this will keep people working within the system. Fairness. If you do link this to pay, which is not an obligatory part of this reform, but if you do choose to link these different statuses to pay, then it means that your teachers who put in the effort to improve and demonstrate that they are teaching well are the ones that get paid the most. You don't have the situation where a very hard-working teacher is frustrated where their colleague in the classroom next door very rarely turns up for their lessons and is still on a high salary. And finally, professionalism. As Andrea Schleicher was saying in the plenary session this morning, it's really important that teaching is seen as a profession in which there are knowledge and skills that all teachers ought to have. And this would be one way of recognizing that and defining what that looks like. So how do you actually go about doing this? What are the potential pitfalls in implementing a teacher career structure reform? So my first do, the do's and don'ts of implementation, is actually very similar to Emiliana's just now. And that is base your career structure around teacher standards. So define what it is, have a consultation, talk to people, involve teacher unions. What does an excellent teacher look like? How is that different from what a new teacher looks like? Because you will hope you will have standards for a new teacher as well. The alternative, which is done in some countries, is rather than having standards, is to say, in order to be a master teacher, you have to do this professional development and get this many points in your lesson evaluation. The problem with that is it becomes a bit tick-boxy. People just say, oh, I want to get that promotion, so what do I have to do? Oh, yes, boom, boom, boom. Instead, we want teachers to be looking at the standards and the knowledge and saying, oh, I need to understand properly how to do formative assessment in my lessons. Don't leave the decision about promotion up to just one person. This is a pitfall. So there was a teacher career structure implemented in Missouri, in America, and the downfall, according to researchers who evaluated this program, was that it was only the head teacher making the decision about who to promote, the principal. Sorry, this is my Englishness coming out. The principal. It was only them, and that meant that they have a good relationship. They don't want to let anyone down. Everyone passed. And if everyone passes, whether they are meeting those standards or not, there's no point in having the reform. This promotion loses its status if everyone gets it. Instead, you should have a second person to come and have a look and see whether the lessons, their portfolios actually match these standards or not. That could be a peer, it could be another teacher within the school. Ideally, especially at the higher levels, it should be someone from external to the school who can come and verify what the principal is saying. Don't put teachers in competition with one another. Their peers, anyway. Different when we're looking at national scale of going to different countries, going to different counties around the country. So if you put teachers in competition with one another and say, right, we're only going to accept 20% onto this rung, then teachers stop collaborating. If they see that they're competing with the person in the classroom next door, they won't share ideas. Instead, design your reform so that everyone that meets these knowledge and skill standards gets that promotion, but be very careful that you've piloted it first to make sure that that is an appropriate level and you don't have everyone then achieving that promotion. And finally, again, very pleased to be echoing what you said, given your expertise in this area, is the idea of introducing this reform gradually. So as I said, pilot it first. Check that your standards are appropriate. If they're too hard, no one will bother attempting it. If they're too easy, everyone will get it, and then you're back to where you started because they haven't had to improve in order to get that position. Bring it in for new teachers only. There are financial implications to this, of course. If you are introducing this with salary attached, you need to start off by saying this is only for new teachers. Give the option of experienced teachers for joining, but you can't mandate and say, right, all senior teachers now, you're on this new structure, you're having a pay cut, because that won't go down well. They might go for the prestige of it. Even if you don't link it to salary, there's a possibility that they will see, yes, I want to be recognized for all the work that I'm doing. I want to be a master teacher. I want to be supporting my colleagues. And go for it, even if you don't link this to the salary initially. So that's my pitch. Bring in teacher career structures, new positions for teachers, so that they can demonstrate and you can recognize the quality teachers that you have in your system and motivate everyone else to attain those standards too. Thank you.
Emilia and Lucy, excellent. May I get you both to stand up here while we have you in the firing line of Your Excellencies. Your Excellencies, can we please start with some questions as deep and as probing as possible, please? We're trying to get this to be practical for you.
Well, for me, it might be late, maybe for the future ministers that are in the room. But these are extremely important issues. And initially, I was an economist when I got into the position, so I didn't know anything about education. When I started to understand how difficult it is to deal with the issue of quality teachers, in ensuring quality teaching, then I thought maybe we just need to find a different solution, like look for machines or something else, the IT. But then I realized that this was not feasible. So when you have a profession that is not really being sick, the people who are applying to become teachers are not the best young people. Of course, you then have the issue of how do you train them, but that's the second issue. And you can't really have a choice. You have to work with what is there. You can't have a high demand for these people because if you come up with very rigorous standards and tests and exams and so on, you might find out that nobody is going to pass the exam. So it's extremely difficult if you don't have a good motivation system, the financial motivation system, I mean. I know that this is not the only motivation element, but this is very important. And because we did actually this with the school managers, and this is my first question, it's about the decentralization vis-a-vis centralization. Would you believe that this should be done more at the school level, like you said, the school principal should do this, or there should be a centralized model? In this case, it becomes extremely difficult to manage such a process. But we started with the school managers because in Moldova, the school managers have been there for 40 years. They would just keep the position forever and nobody would do anything to this. So we managed to promote a law which would put them in a competition basis. So once in 5 years, they had to compete for the position. Of course, politically, it was extremely difficult. It took us 2 years to promote this law, but we managed. And when we were designing the basic test for this people who would compete for the position of school managers so that they finally take at least a test, we knew that we're not going to be in the ministry forever, that politicians come and go. So we were thinking, how do you design this test that there is no corruption and cheating and so on? And we managed to put something on a computer-based and so on. Unfortunately, after we left, my team, we left the ministry, the test is there, but the corruption is also there, so we can't say that this mechanism works well. So my question is, would you opt for a decentralized model of this evaluation or a centralized model? And then how do you deal with these issues of corruption, especially in a country which is poor, where the salaries are very small? When you link the results with the salary, with this coefficient, then there is a big issue of corruption. So how do you deal with it?
I'll start. It's not an easy question. But I would say every country is different. But if like in your country, in many Latin American countries, the average salary of teachers is relatively low compared to those of professionals in other fields. And so it's very hard to, on top of paying them a salary that's low, to ask them now to go through an evaluation that will determine whether they get a pay raise. So I would say one of the first priorities for I think a minister committed to improving teaching is to fight with the Ministry of Finance to get more resources for the sector, and at first improve the average salaries of all. Once you've kind of advanced on that, and maybe in parallel of that, you can introduce an evaluation, but that's not high stakes, so that it's not tied to salary. That is really, as I suggested at first, a framed and really with the intent of understanding what are the strengths and weaknesses of all the teachers, of each individual teacher, and then helping them improve based on a clear standard and a clear map of expectations. But I would say it's very hard to have high stakes evaluation in contexts where pay is low and working conditions are difficult. In those cases, very often you get corruption. And so I would say you want to first correct kind of the basic conditions and then introduce gradually more stakes into the
That's
evaluation.
why I left the ministry. I ran for the presidency. Unfortunately, I lost 4 months ago by 4 percentage points. But that was my idea, that you have to get into politics, you have to control the parliament in order to be able to make reforms in education. So, but that's...
Lucy, could we have your 2 cents?
Sure. So I think it depends on how centralized or decentralized it is, has to depend on what stage of the career structure you're talking about. So realistically, if you're, let's take the Shanghai example, if to go from a 3rd grade teacher to a 2nd grade teacher, you would be expecting almost all of your teachers to make that move. This is not something which only a small percentage are going to get. And you can't have some centralized agency assessing all of those teachers. So I think at the lower levels, when it's less high stakes, because it's more likely the teachers are going to get it, I think that does have to be done at the school level. But like I said, not by one person, maybe by a head teacher and a peer, or a teacher from another school. As you move up, though, when it comes to the promotions that not everyone is going to get, I think it's important that you do have some centralization, not necessarily at a national level, but at a local level or a regional level. So you would have a board of people who are in charge of controlling, checking that this is actually going smoothly, and checking that this is not corrupt. Make sure you're not recruiting corrupt people to that board. But I mean, there's no way of saying for sure that there will be no corruption. But I think if you have your checks and balances externally to the school, then that can help for those more senior levels. And moderation of why. So in addition to that, have I suppose you can call it an inspectorate, but who would go around and do spot checks and check, okay, you said this teacher is a master teacher, I'm going to go and watch them teach and show me their portfolio, and let me double check that everyone around the country is on the same page of what that means.
Your Excellency, your questions, please.
Thank you. Thank you for both presentations, very inspiring. I want to ask you, because I'm thinking here, I don't know that many countries that are very good, or let's say governments that are very good at educating poor children. Maybe Vietnam or Singapore, exceptions. So I don't know how these models you're proposing will work in a resource-constrained environment where education is constantly in the state of emergency and where things don't normally follow clean stages of implementation. So I am intrigued by that. And then talk to us more about the financial implications for the 7 steps. You said Panama had 9 steps, but you proposing 7. So I think 2 steps you reduced, and I'm wondering why.
Are these questions clear? There were 2 very
Sure.
good questions there. I'm curious to hear the answers myself.
Should I start this time? Is that all right? So I think I do have different answers for if you're talking about a low resource context and in a context where there is a state of emergency or conflict or challenges additionally to low resource. I think in a low resource setting, if you have enough stability to implement a reform, I think this can work because it needn't be associated with a significant salary hike. There are other incentives that you can have that would work well for recognizing the positions. So partly, I mean, it might be enough in itself, just the status. You can reduce the teacher's timetable so they have additional non-teaching time to go and help their colleagues, and that way, you know, it's a clear step up. You can, so one thing that they're doing in Ghana at the moment, I believe, is offering teachers very low interest loans. So you could bring in an incentive like that. So you can be creative about the kind of incentives. They don't all have to be in addition to your salary. So that makes it easier in the lower resource settings. I think if you are in a situation where there are more challenges in addition to that, I don't think actually that the teacher career structure, that it would be the right time to implement that. I think the priority there has to be making sure that teachers are receiving their salaries on time and that the basic salary structure is intact. So because that's a fundamental for teacher motivation, is to have your basic needs met before you can then start thinking about intrinsic motivation, fulfillment in your career. If you haven't got the salary arriving when it's supposed to, then that's more pressing in some situations. So I suppose I wouldn't necessarily advocate my policy pitch to every country in the world at the current position that they're in. It does require a period of some stability to implement it properly.
I would agree. And in terms of your question about going from 9 to 7, there were very different steps I was referring to, and I'm sorry if I wasn't so clear. I was referring in the Panama case of the bureaucratic steps, not processes. There's no, for example, teacher evaluation or a framework of teacher competencies. They're actually in the process of beginning to develop this, and we're helping them. But I just meant that from the moment a teacher position opens and several teachers want it, whoever is selected, which right now is based on a ranking of merits, based on years of education and courses, basically, and whether they've been in service, then it takes 9 different parts of the bureaucracy, and at the very last stage, the president of the entire country, to sign a paper that allows that decision to be implemented. So that was very different from the type of process I was suggesting.
Please, sir.
Another quick one. How do you mainstream gender in these steps? Or recruitment, what do you do to motivate more women in the teaching force? In your experience, what is being done in the countries that you work in?
Sorry?
I can let you start on that one.
That's a very good question. In most of Latin America, the teaching profession is very feminine, mostly. So more the issue is how do you incentivize men to enter teaching? And I think part of the reason it is feminine has to do with cultural factors, that it was one of the first professions that opened up to work to mothers as an alternative, as a reasonable alternative. But also over time, as our education systems in the region expanded and there was an increasing need for teachers to fill a mass education system, the standards, as Lucy was saying, lowered, and it made it, let's say, and also opportunities for females expanded in other professions. And so it made it such that it is, as the minister was saying, not the profession of choice for the top students in high school to enter to studying teacher training. So one of the big challenges in terms of both men and women in teaching in Latin America is how do you make it an attractive profession in terms of career structure and also salary and benefits so that talented men and women want to enter. And I would say I don't know of any country that has completely solved this. I would say one of the countries in our region that's making progress in this way is Chile, by having first done a framework of what it means to be an effective teacher, having established an accreditation system for teacher education programs, and also providing financial incentives in the form of scholarships for the most talented secondary school students to choose to enter teaching, so they get a free higher education that is accredited. And also by programs such as the one that is being represented here in the forum, that is called Elige Educar, or Choose to Teach, which is basically a major effort to raise the status of the profession in the minds of society by saying it's a very valuable profession, it's fun, it requires talent, and by rewarding and partnering with Varki to do a teacher prize in Chile, such as the Global Teacher Prize. So I think a lot of efforts to raise to make teaching attractive to talented men and women.
So similarly, in the countries I've been to, it hasn't always been more men or more women. It's varied from context to context. I think it's really important to have a balance. I would be very wary of introducing any kind of quotas or positive discrimination when it came to getting these promotions, because I think that might undermine the credibility if people think, oh, well, he's got it because he's a man or she's got it because she's a woman. I think depending on the context, I think the more sensible approach would be to look at the causes. If you find that it's all men getting these promotions and not women, so my own context, for example, in England, although the teaching profession is overwhelmingly female, there are many more male head teachers, more male principals than you would expect given the composition. So I think it's important to look at the reasons for that and try and, I mean, this will be different, completely different depending on the context, but try and address some of the causes of that, some of the challenges. So for example, is it to do with childcare and ability to pick children up after work and having to leave early or go part-time? In which case you might want to say that, okay, if you become one of these lead teachers, it does give you flexibility to work 3 days a week, for example. You know, it'll be very much dependent on the context. I wouldn't want to see it deliberately woven into a teacher career structure, because I think that might damage its credibility.
Do Your Excellencies have any more questions? Yes, please.
You talked about defining standards together with other stakeholders in the society and then evaluating the teachers based on these stakeholders. Don't you think that, at least for societies like the one I come from, you might get a kind of an old-fashioned way of evaluating teachers? And I'm saying this based on some experiences. For instance, we introduced no grades for the primary school, and there was such a negative reaction from the parents because they just wanted their kids, even in the first class, in the first grade, to have grades. I mean, to show something. This is 10 or this is 2, and so on. So what is it the most important? What are the most important elements of good evaluation systems? Is it kids' grades, or is it exams, levels, or what is it that should be there? And how do you ensure that actually you don't get into an old-fashioned evaluation program if you do a broad participation process?
So there's a lot of recent evidence of what works to evaluate teachers, and basically the best is evaluation systems that combine multiple elements, including classroom observations of teacher practices by an external, it could be another teacher, it can be the principal, but someone who has a certain guidance as to what good teaching practice looks like, and that is defined by that framework as well. Then also, some of it has to do with how much are students learning, if you can actually measure that and do it over time so that you actually have a baseline and a fine line. Also, self-evaluation of teachers, sometimes they can reflect on their own practice, and also other teachers who observe you, who are your peers, not necessarily coming to an external evaluation. So recent studies show that a combination of these are the best ways, and how you actually weigh them may vary over time. So for example, if you don't have strong student assessment systems or that are very reliable, you don't want to weigh that as very much. But you still might want to give a signal that that's important. Obviously, you know, a teacher is there to help students learn. And so not including that altogether may be undesirable. At the same time, you know, how you have and what kind of external perspective is observing the teacher and how that is being processed or analyzed is also very important. And some systems use video recordings and have, you know, like the class system. Others use an expert perspective. A lot of it, again, I was talking about this communication strategy, and also at the beginning, you know, having these conversations with all stakeholders, because I think it will not work if it's imposed by a government, no matter how technically sound it is. It has to be respected and thought of as fair by the main actors, who are the teachers and the parents and the principals. They need to feel that they're not going to be, for example, penalized if they're caught on a bad day, or that, as Lucy was saying, someone who doesn't make a lot of effort and doesn't have good results is going to get the same reward. So all that is not easy, I know, but I think that having no evaluation clearly and relying on just, you know, teachers who are just maybe attending classes and not much else and staying there for years, and that being the main reason of promotion and permanence in the profession also has shown in many of our systems not to work. So we know that, as in every other profession, as I always say, in the banks, in multilateral institutions, we get evaluated. In the private sector, people get evaluated, and it comes with, you know, some consequences and also some supports. So in teaching, because we are, as you said at the beginning, so vested in our teachers. No matter how much we wanted to improve teachers, we have what we have, and we have to work with them. It's very important to start giving them information of what we expect of them and how they're matching up to that, but accompanied by support.
So excuse me, in the interest of time, I don't mean to cut you off. I would like to open this up. I can take one concise question from the audience, please, before we put this up to a vote. Does anybody have any questions here? There is a prize if you ask a question. Please.
Right next to me. Thanks very much. I think, you know, a lot of interesting stuff coming out there. It's interesting, you mentioned intrinsic motivation once. A lot of studies I've read at least, show that if you ask a teacher why they became a teacher, it's not for money, it's not for all of these sorts of things. It's the children. And when you're doing professional development, what's the feedback you need? It's coming from the children. And the social status, I agree with you, the social status. But another area, and when we're looking at professional development, doesn't matter, again, what sector you're looking at, I think something that we do need to have in mind is that teachers are provided with choice and control over their own professional development. And I just got a kind of feeling, and I know policy is macro level and all the rest of it, but I got a kind of feeling that in both instances, the teacher was being a subject of change, not an object of change, rather than the subject of their own professional development. And I was just wondering how, you know, you balance that up within the policy that you're doing, as well as, you know, that sort of level.
Okay, do you want to
Sure.
start?
Brief. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, really important model, has been since updated by the authors of that model initially. Self-determination theory, really, really quickly. It's not only about actually intrinsically enjoying the work that you're doing, but having the same goal as the institution you're working in, I suppose, in terms of, I don't enjoy marking. Teachers generally don't. Marking isn't fun. So it's not intrinsic motivation that makes me do it. It's the fact that I want the best for the children. If the professional development is going to make me a better teacher, then I should be motivated to do that as well, so that I am improving those outcomes for the children. And if you look at if you have a system where it's standards as opposed to tick boxes, then the teacher is able to look across the knowledge and skills, self-evaluate and say, right, I think I need to develop in this area because this is a particular challenge I'm having. Ideally, in contexts that allow it, I'm going to seek out that professional development to help me reach that. So it can be done badly. It can be done in a way that allows teachers to have that autonomy.
And just to clarify and also enhance what you were saying, I think the teacher has to be kind of the person who carves her own professional improvement, but the system has to provide him or her with information about basically what you expect of a really solid teacher, and then how she or he fares against that, and then with lots of opportunities to, once they know, for example, I may be really good at math overall, but better at subtraction than addition, or at division than multiplication. Once I identify what exactly are my weaknesses, that I have the access to find the support I need to improve. I do agree with you that all teachers want to improve. All professionals want to be effective, and that is a huge source of motivation to stay in the job. So all this kind of goes in that direction as well.
Thank you. So now we get to the closing and the hard part about voting onto which idea would be applicable and practical. So I'm going to give some context here. Both amazing, interesting, valid concepts. Practicalities based off from what I'm hearing, a lot of the corruption, and from both of you, the quality and the level of teachers, and then dealing with the local, on the ground, state of emergency, craziness that happens. Can I open it up to the both of you and all of you? Lucy's pitch on teacher career structures, and Emilia's pitch on transparency and accountability. Career structures, right hand. Transparency, accountability, left hand.
It's a competition.
It's a competition.
Oh, I didn't know.
It's just not a real competition.
No, we're on the same side.
It's more about applications to your countries. Your Excellencies.
Of course, both presentations are important and really good, but the details are really, the difficult part is the implementation. So I would, if I had the possibility again, try this, and we have started some of it, but then I would ask both of you to come and help with the
You're both needed. Excellent. Your Excellency?
Actually, I would say the same. I didn't see both of them as talking about the same thing. One says this is how you should recruit a teacher, these are the steps. The other said, once you recruit the teacher, this is how to retain the teacher to get the best out of him or her. So both are needed.
So we kind of see a joint vote here. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Excellencies.
Thank you, everybody.